Okay, so the motivation behind this talk was really driven by the fact that when I speak with people who aren't deeply involved in open source, whether that's people generally within companies or, you know, friends, colleagues, and others, you tend to have, or I tend to get these kind of questions where people are saying, why does it make sense for me to do open source? You know, I'm giving away my effort, my skills for free. How do companies make money with open source? You know, it's all for free. It just doesn't make sense to me. I kind of understand it's a great collaboration thing, but I don't get it from a business perspective. Okay? And I think this is actually a really important question because it's not something we tend to prepare for when we're speaking about open source. You know, we'll prepare all our arguments about, well, here are all our benefits, and we'll prepare our arguments about, oh, open source is great for collaborative innovation and things like that. But the fundamental part of why should a business do open source is not so easy to define, and it's not something we tend to think about so much. Hence, it's a compelling question. Okay, so thank you, Thierry, for your slide that basically said the same thing in a different manner. We all know these are the history of open source and free software, right? Software was not valued. Then it was valued. It got taken over by the notion of proprietary licenses, and free software was created to push back against this. It's a classic liberalist movement, freedom of use, and the great things that came with it. A moral good, a pragmatic approach to creating better software. There were many arguments given, but it was basically or fundamentally a reaction against the restrictions being placed on software. So, Thierry, thank you. Of course, we also know that free is not such a business-friendly word. Hence, and Simon earlier today gave me a wonderful expression, I think it was linguistic framing. So if I say free software, people think free, right? And even when you explain then that it doesn't mean free, they've got free stuck in their mind, and that's the end of the story. And we know that created the need for a rebranding exercise. So bring in the marketeers who created the wonderful open source. Small story, why have I got a hippo in some of my diagrams? Because isn't open source a penguin or something, right? Hippos, you see, they're really misunderstood, aren't they? We all think of them as these cuddly little creatures. They hide in the water. You get these little flappy ears. And they're really cute, right? You're missing this giant-sized bulk that's underneath and the fact that they kill lots of people in Africa. I.e., they're a hidden presence, a hidden power. And I think that speaks closely to open source. So in terms of capitalism, let's get the elephant out of the room, or bring the elephant into the room, and let's talk about copyright, because obviously copyright is central to everything we're talking about here, right? So we know that copyright embodies a capitalistic notion of ownership. So if you're looking at communistic endeavors, you'll think of a commons, a public good, but you're not thinking about ownership, whereas copyright is really about ownership. Okay, so when we talk about copyright, we use terms such as intellectual property. We use terms such as copyright protection. We use things like rights of attribution. So it's all about ownership. I own something. I've created something, I own it. It's not for the public good, it's mine. And the copyright licenses are then the mechanism by which I can capture value around that. So we grant rights. We will sell our licenses or exchange them for value. And since value capture and value accumulation are core tenets of neoliberal capitalism, my argument here is that free and open source software are fundamentally capitalist in nature. They would not have existed if software had been ignored by all the copyright stuff, but it wasn't, so people pushed back. Copyright created the need for FLOSS, and copyright created the mechanism of FLOSS, which is quite a cunning thing for the people who invented the free software movement at the beginning to have seen. But let's go beyond the question of capitalism, and it's all very theoretical kind of embodiment within monetary models. Let's think about business. So business, it's all about profit, right? Well, yeah, it is and it isn't. I think the talk about profit is kind of reductionist. So when we think about business, we talk about generating revenue. I want to make money, right? But if we're thinking about profit, we also have to think about things like, well, we have to limit our expenses. We might think about things like cash flows, or we might think about seizing new market opportunities, or selling products, exploiting network effects. Sorry. So when we're looking at business in a capitalistic enterprise, the term profit is reductionist, and what we should really be thinking about is how we create a value return to the stakeholders, whether they're shareholders or whether they're, private company owners. And when we think about capturing value, so fat stacks, yo, we can have different approaches to capturing value, right? So everyone has said, well, open source is not the business model. Correct. There are different approaches to capturing value, right? So let's monetize around our open source product. And this will become more clear. The distinction I'm making here will become more clear when I go into the next slide. We can be indirect. We can monetize within the open source product. And then, of course, maybe less directly as well, we can monetize intellectual property, because we know open source is based on copyright, so intellectual property and all of that. So let's monetize around the intellectual property. So there are different ways to create value directly, to capture value, should I say, directly with open source. So when we talk about capturing value directly, what I'm talking about is using my open source product and actually creating the value from that product itself. So I'm going to sell my professional services. I'm not going to sell the code. I could sell the code. There's nothing in the licenses that forbids me, but I don't think I'd have many customers given that the code is available for free. So I'm going to sell my professional services. This is a common one. Everyone knows these models, right? I'm going to sell a packaged bundle. Okay, so there are companies out there that sell open source as part of a larger bundle. I'm going to sell my optional add-ons, my connectors, my themes. They're optional, they don't harm the core experience. Great, sell them. Contextually important software extensions. Now this is where it becomes a slightly more ambiguous, because this is where we're talking about extensions which sometimes can actually be operationally necessary for the open source product. I'm not going to mention any examples, but they exist. We all know of them. And so this is the open core model. Okay, and of course we have dual licensing, which touches on the IP side as well. So, hey, let's make money with open source. But how many of us have thought about making money inside our open source product? Okay, so I think if any of you are working for electronic companies here, you probably already know that you are selling products that have open source bricks contained within them, yet your product is not open source. Okay, so that's a pretty obvious one. Everyone is doing it, right? Everyone is creating their DVD players, their digital cameras, their cars, and they are capturing value from open source through a larger project. Some people are creating open source marketplaces and taking a sales cut from those marketplaces. Some people, and you could do this on literally any product, in-app advertising and in-app transactions. Nothing stops you with open source to have this amazing open source experience where you're advertising through it. I mean, games make huge amounts of money that way, so we know there's money in just the advertising side, right? And then, of course, the evil collect, collate, exploit user data. Now, should be done with the user permissions, of course, but sometimes it's not. And that's a whole different area. But of course, the user data is something that can create value. And then we mentioned as the other way of capturing value around intellectual property. Now, this is quite a complex slide, so I'm not going to go into all the details. I like to use the term innovation triangle when we talk about open source, standards, and patents. So there is an interrelation between these elements. Now, if we're looking at just patents, okay, now we can monetize around the patents. You know, people who are into patents and all of that kind of thing, they probably have loads of models around that. I've just taken out a simplistic approach here. We can monetize those patents. We can sell the patents. Okay, we can license them out. I think there are companies, I guess Qualcomm or other companies that have loads of patents and they license patents out. We can provide our patent into a standard, and then we can create licensing money from that. But of course, we can also, from the patent, create open source. And then we can monetize our open source. Now, we've seen how we can already monetize the open source, but we could also have a trademark or a logo. Now, these can be used to protect your open source. There's a certain mark of telephone that uses the trademark and logo quite cleverly to protect its part of its use of open source, which it developed. And by creating licenses and trademarks and licensing around that, we can then expand and monetize a third-party ecosystem, which can also generate us money. So not only can we sell our own product, we can have an ecosystem develop products, we can get money from those products, so it's a nice value multiplier. So there are some ways we can capture value, right? But what about generating value? Now, if we generate value with open source, this is where we come into the classic things of benefits of open source, right? When I talk to people in governance or open source program office, they're going to talk about how we have the benefits of open source. For me, this is the value generation side of open source. Okay, the value capture side, that's for the business people. Us open source people, we don't look at that. That's the business people that look at that. But value generation, but that's the benefits of open source. Okay, and there's loads of them. It's a whole feast of benefits. Okay, so creating strategic value. One of the benefits is creating strategic value. So when we create strategic value for our company, market penetration. We can use open source as a way of getting into a market more easily, especially when there are entrenched players, or if there are no entrenched players and the market is chaotic and we see that there is a gap that we could move into. Let's use open source to get in there. Okay, we can talk about digital sovereignty. A lot of companies think of open source as a way of improving digital sovereignty. Governments also are interested in open source around the notion of digital sovereignty, whether it's disrupting vendor lock-in or controlling your code, or whichever notion you would like to choose out of that. Sharing is caring. Well, actually, in this case, sharing is not really caring. Sharing is kind of just giving someone else half of your problems. Sharing is caring. So we can share the risks. If we're doing open source in a community, we can share risks. If there's a problem in the community, or if people aren't trusting us, well, they're maybe going to trust us a bit more if we're in a multi-party community. And the same thing goes for costs. The other one is product quality, peer review, collaborative development. I think these are also fairly strategic for companies, although you could think of it as more of an operational thing. So talking of operational value, and I need to accelerate slightly, we have economic efficiency. It's a great benefit, changing CapEx to OpEx, making sure that our free cash flows are more available with open source, things like that. Investing wisely. So let's invest in us, not paying licenses, which goes to finance somebody else's roadmap. That doesn't seem to make much sense to me. And of course, company culture, so the human aspects, extremely important. We should never forget that. So I'm nearly at the end, which is good because I've only got a few minutes left. So when we talk about the human aspect, 60% of people are doing open source in their spare time. I think that's really a significant number. I think there's two significations around that. The first one is that it just shows how much value, and I don't want to reuse that word, but how much value developers are placing on open source, how much enjoyment they're getting from open source, in that they are doing open source, they are choosing, they are selecting to do open source in their free time. And I think the flip side of that is, why are they doing it in their free time? Why aren't they being paid? What's going on there? We know there's a problem on that side. 80 to 90% of companies or public institutions are creating or leveraging open source. Fantastic. 91% of respondents to a survey actually say that they see open source as vital to their industry. So what we are seeing here is that companies massively see value in open source. Okay, and we know that open source creates massive value, 65 to 95 billion, which is quite a large kind of range. I suppose you would take the middle, which is around 80, right? Billion euros to the European GDP. So companies are extracting and are valuing open source immensely in what they're doing. So when we say open source is an ethical good, it's a public commons, that's why it exists, we're also missing the capitalistic side and the value point of capitalistic side. So to wrap up, I've gone through a lot of slide points here. Open source is fundamentally capitalist. That was our kind of statement, a bold statement. It could also be, you could put it as a question mark. It works both ways. So let's go through the 4 points here. So open source, so the extension of copyright, capitalist notion, remember, triggered to software, triggered the need for FLOSS. Okay. Copyright licenses, again, capitalist notion, are a prerequisite for open source. You can't have open source or free and open source software without a copyright license. It's a meaningless sentence, that one. We know that open source is delivering huge amount of value capture and value generation to companies, and we've seen how that can be done. And on the inverse side, why we haven't talked about it too much, we also know that for a significant amount of open source out there, it's capitalistic endeavour that is paying for that open source, whether it's developers who are working at companies and working on projects, or if it's developers that are working at the weekend but they're getting paid somewhere else. So one way or another, we know that capitalism, in one form or another, has a huge impact in the payment for open source. So to wrap it up, I would say that while maybe the ethical motivations or the moral motivations may not have been capitalist in the original sense, I would say that FLOSS, or free, lib, and open source software, is fundamentally entwined with capitalist enterprise. These days, you literally can't have one without the other, which is why I think the two are linked. And I think it's an important message we need to pass to business leaders, is that with open source, there are significant routes to value generation and value capture. Right. Thank you very much. We have 1 minute left for questions, so I guess one question.